Great to see you all. We're really lucky to have Dr. John Maxwell Hamilton, we call him Jack around the Overseas Press Club, join us tonight to talk about his new book, which is a real academic labor of love. I can't imagine, but he'll tell us, I trust, how much work went into this, but I can tell you it was a lot. Anyway, as you may have deduced from the program announcement, he's really a Renaissance man who's still pursuing a distinguished, multifaceted career. As a newsman, he's reported from and traversed more than 4 countries. As an educator, he was the founding dean of the Manship School of Journalism at Louisiana State University. As an author, he's written a number of books, including one of particular interest to our membership, an authoritative book about foreign correspondence called Journalism's Roving Eye, A History of American News Gathering Abroad. He's been an OPC member since 2010, and Jack currently holds an endowed chair in journalism at Louisiana State and is a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars and a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, both of which are in Washington. Now, Dr. Hamilton's latest fascination is a deep dive into the events that occurred a century ago, which he believes reverberates today. Jack's investigation documents how the American government, under President Woodrow Wilson a century ago, laid the foundations for the government to build a propaganda machine designed to mislead the public. Using World War I as the rationale for establishing the Committee on Public Information, the Wilson administration in 1917 put together a propaganda playbook that foreshadow what has gone on to varying degrees in subsequent administrations. In Hamilton's view, these perversions of truth represent a persistent threat to democracy. Now, Jack will help us enjoy his latest book, Manipulating the Masses, Woodrow Wilson and the Birth of American Propaganda. Dr. Hamilton, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Allan. I've enjoyed our association over many years, and I appreciate the chance to talk to the club. I'm going to get right into it because I want to cover a few points, and then I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions. In my experience, the questions are the best part of this, but I think I ought to hit on several things. And I've changed my talk this evening a little bit from what I normally do, because I want to single out the role of journalists during the war, which is something I bring up in the book, which is not talked about very much. And I think I have something to say on that point about how journalists really gave up the franchise to a large extent in terms of what they should have done in terms of coverage. So I'm going to talk about the CPI, I'm going to talk about the book, and and talk about the journalists, and then I'm going to talk about the significance today, and then we'll get to questions. So there's to me a very revealing anecdote, and it was the 1917 Gridiron Dinner. The Committee on Public Information was created 1 week after we went to war in April 1917. It's our first and only propaganda ministry. Everything that we see today in presidential propaganda has its roots in what happened in World War I and Woodrow Wilson. And George Creel, who was the a muckraking journalist who was the chairman, so-called chairman, but director of the CPI, the Committee on Public Information. And to give you a sense of how quickly he became influential in Washington, we can go to that Gridiron Dinner, where, of course, we all know Washington journalists roast Washington officials. The dinner, three of the skits actually dealt with Creel, who was at the head table sitting right next to Herbert Hoover, and who was the food conservation czar at the time. And one of the skits made a joke out of the fact of what was called the July Hoax, when the United States Navy was on its way to Europe and had a sort of encounter with the Germans, an uncertain encounter for which there was little evidence, but George Creel embroidered the story so much that it sounded like a huge attack in which the United States had fended it off and had been glorious, which quickly became untrue and led to this view that he was in charge. He had perpetrated the so-called July Hoax. There was also a joke about Creel being the censor, and that there was supposed to be no liquor in Washington at that point. Washington had prohibition in the district, even if it hadn't happened nationally. And they joked that Creel was the censor of a hip pocket flask he had with him. And then finally, there was a skit, a spoof with which 4 foreign high commissioners were briefed on the American government. Didn't the government have 3 branches? One of the commissioners asked. 4, their American interlocutor replied. The executive, the Congress, the judiciary, and the Committee on Public Information. When the dignitaries asked what the CPI did, they were told its job was to inculcate a proper respect for the administration. Right now, it's the whole cheese. I mean, it's all to the good. The main squeeze, the grand gazebo, the Lollapalooza. Understand? Well, this is a significant skit because today we use the word spin when we talk about what the government did. In World War I, the word was creeling, named after the commissioner, George Creel, the head of the CPI, George Creel. The CPI only existed for the time we were in the war, which is about 1.5 years. But in that short period of time, it managed to shoot propaganda through every capillary of the American blood system. It was a publishing conglomerate. It had pamphlets and news services, both in the United States and abroad. It had syndicated features, as well as not only news stories by some of the best writers in the country, but also it had cartoons that were syndicated. It had thousands of press releases. Before the CPI existed, press releases were a feature of government, but they were episodic. Now it was an unrelenting torrent. And they made the press release a standard of American governance. They had a division of pictorial publicity, which produced poster designs, cards, advertisements, seals, and buttons for 98 agencies and committees, the latter ranging from the Federation of Neighborhood Associations to the Salvation Army. It distributed tens of thousands of slides, propaganda slides, pictures taken by the military. It piggybacked on the motion picture industry, advertising associations, universities, and other professional bodies that gave it pathways into the American mind, into the American home. The Boy Scouts, traveling salesmen, and corporate titans did the CPI's bidding. Its advertisements were ubiquitous. In newspapers and magazines, families watched CPI films when they went to the theaters. And I want to stop there to just focus on one particular point because it's very revealing about the CPI, and that is the 4-minute men, an idea that Creel conceived of within 72 hours of getting the job. Some young man from Chicago came in and suggested it. And the idea was that somebody representing the CPI would stand up in movie theaters during the changing of theater, the films in the theaters, because in those days, the reels of film had to be changed. And they would speak for 4 minutes. And these men and some women became the 4-minute men. It's hard to imagine this, but there were 75,000 4-minute men by the end of the war, speaking in theaters, mostly in theaters, but at logging camps, in revival meetings, at county fairs. They were all over the United States. It was an enormous achievement, and they looked like they were local, and they were. They were local lawyers, local journalists, local judges, local bankers, but they were very, very, what's the word I want to use? But they were very orchestrated from Washington. And so they looked local, but they were doing exactly what the CPI wanted them to do every minute. Think about the CPI's propaganda was that sometimes it was benign in the sense that it provided real information, and this was a real contribution. But it was also, even when it was benign, it was non-consensual. They used the taxpayer dollars to tell them things that they didn't necessarily ask to be told. And it was impossible to seal yourself off from this propaganda. You could choose not to pick up a newspaper with a CPI ad in it, and you could choose not to walk into a movie theater, but everybody saw CPI posters on streets. In fact, I found a wonderful little postcard in the CPI archives from William Johns, who was the chair of the CPI's Division of Advertising. He was driving near Denver, and he sent this postcard back, marveling at the ubiquity of the CPI's famous Red Cross poster, which had a Virgin Mary-like nurse on it. The poster, he said, was in the windows of towns on the prairies, towns as hardly as large as this postal card out in the flat, arid lands. That's how far-reaching the CPI was. I will stop on the background of the CPI with just one final point. In addition to it being non-consensual, there was censorship. They used coercion. They were tendentious. They used fear and appeal to emotion. There were front organizations that had no apparent attachment to the CPI, but in fact were mouthpieces for the CPI. And they were involved in disinformation, including one of the great disinformation scams of the 20th century. In fact, one of the first great ones.